Hey all, so I hope you're doing very well today. It is another snowy day here, and it's a perfect day for another repotting video. This is going to be more of a repotting care video, however. So I have my Dioscorea elephantipes here, and this one you probably will remember it from 365 Days of Plants. And I'm going to do repotting with this video and talk you through some kind of interesting facts about Dioscorea and some helpful care tips. If you're new to caudiciforms or plants that have caudixes, which is like the swollen base, which you'll be able to see here, this one's kind of a tiny one. This is a swollen stem, so that's what a caudix is. Basically, it's the part between the roots and the first two true leaves, which are called the cotyledons. So as the plant is growing, it sticks out these two leaves called cotyledons, and then they have the root, and the stem basically expands and gets swollen. And the most, I think, one of the most popular, I wouldn't say the most popular, but one of the most popular caudiciforms is Dioscorea elephantipes. And it's particularly because, one, they get so large, they could get, 3, maybe even 4 feet across. And they get these kind of plates and fissures on the plant itself. And I want to say that I want to kick myself in the pants because early on, when I was interested in plants, and this was like many moons ago, so like a decade plus ago, as I started to collect plants, I found a very large Dioscorea elephantipes. And I have to say, I was not, it was my first caudiciform. I think it was actually my first caudiciform, and I didn't know how to take care of it. And I feel ashamed because it was such a large plant. So it was about this big, and I kind of forgot about it. And it's so easy to forget about many of the caudiciforms because they are deciduous, which you don't really think about it. You think like, well, when you're in the northern hemisphere, it makes sense that plants are deciduous, which means that it loses their leaves, and oftentimes in autumn and winter. Well, this is kind of like the opposite. This plant is originally from South Africa in the Cape Provinces, and it basically will lose its leaves in the summer months. And part of the reason for that, when you have something that's deciduous during the summer months, it's usually because of drought. And caudiciforms, many caudiciforms, most of them are within kind of that southern African tip, and then Mexico. And you see basically caudiciforms are these swollen stems across many different families of plants. But especially within this group, the Dioscoreaceae, which is where this Dioscorea is a part of, and especially in South Africa. So you see some species primarily like in Mexico, where you see a lot of caudiciforms arise, and then you have some in South Africa. And when it gets really hot in the summer months, a lot of plants will lose their leaves and protect themselves, and the caudiciform or the roots, any kind of geophytes. So geophytes are plants that have tubers or corms or kind of swollen roots or stems, essentially. They will basically hold their sugars, they'll hold their water within those stems or within those root systems, and then they'll lose their leaves until it actually gets a cooling period. So the reason why I wanted to pull this one out is twofold. One is it doesn't really need a repot, but I am going to do a repot because it's going to go in a new location, and I want it to have a nice matching pot for that location. And two, it actually started to put out its leaves in, I would say, late summer here, early autumn, and now it's in like full-fledged foliage right here, as you can see. So this is the time that it actually grows. So our winter is technically the summer months in the Cape Provinces, but in the winter in the Cape Provinces, that's when this actually grows. And it's growing here in the winter. So the cooling weather allows it to actually put out its foliage. And actually, this is where it seems counterintuitive. It's actually a good time to fertilize this plant too, because it's actually in its growing season, believe it or not. So it's interesting in that kind of capacity. I did jump the gun though, because I do want to talk about where this plant got its name. And Dioscorea gets its name from the Greek physician Dioscorides. So when a plant gets a name from the Greek physician Dioscorides, chances are that this is some type of medicinal plant. And we might not view it as a medicinal plant because it might not be a plant that you grew up with, but to the indigenous people who grew up with that plant, there's probably some interesting medicinal property associated with it. And I'll share with you a bit about what that is. And then the Elephantipes, if you could guess, it's Latin for elephant or elephant-like. And that really refers to the caudiciform. And the reason why it's elephant-like, and you'll see it on the small caudiciform, it's already starting to get that kind of like craggy fissure plates that is very characteristic to like an elephant's skin. And as they get larger and larger, I mean, it gets to the size of like an elephant foot, for instance. So I love like looking at the origin of the name, both from the common name as well as the scientific name, because it usually gives you some kind of hint about the pertinence of the plant or the importance of the plant, maybe sometimes to the native culture or to the Latin nomenclature of the plant itself. Sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with it, and oftentimes it does. Now, from the medicinal part, I've been doing a lot more of herbs, herbal remedies. I kind of put that onto the flock channel, which is our second channel. So I'm doing more of that. And it just so happens that Dioscorea is in the same family as yams and sweet potatoes. And yams and sweet potatoes are definitely antioxidant powerhouses. Obviously you see those and they're a little bit more, tuberous, for instance, because they have those like really thickened roots and people use those as food. This is often used as food in the culture where it's from. However, it is also has chemistry in it that is a precursor to steroids. So interestingly enough, some folks will use some of the chemistry from yams or sweet potatoes or Dioscorea in order to use for like bodybuilding, for instance, or it's often used as a natural birth control. I'm not going to tell you how to make it or all that other kind of stuff, but basically that is the chemistry within this plant, and that is how it had been traditionally used. Now, you'll see one of the beautiful features, I think, besides the caudiciform, is this vining nature of the plant with these little cordate or heart-shaped leaves, which I think are just so darling. And typically where this is growing in southern Africa, it is a very sunny part of the world, especially even in the winter months, right? So the vines tend to be a bit more compact. So you'll have some vines that really go trailing out, and it might not be as compact where you are because you might not be giving it as much light as it would typically get in the wild. But typically, the way that these grow in the wild are a bit more of a compact vining structure. And you could see, I guess, characteristic of many caudiciforms is that they have these really thin vines and thin spindly leaves. Not completely, not always. Like if I think about Xeroscios denguii, that is a plant that has a little more of a thicker stem and thicker leaves, and it actually grows a caudiciform. Oftentimes you'll take cuttings of that plant and then it might not form the caudiciform in the same way that if it's seed grown. Many of the Dioscorea are seed grown and will form that caudiciform. You cannot really, to my knowledge, you can't like really take a stem or a little tendril of this and put it in water and voila, it grows. So a lot of folks are actually growing this by seed, and it takes a very, very, very long time for these plants to get a large caudic. So that's why I'm saying in the beginning, I want to kick myself in the pants because I lost that giant Dioscorea that I had in the beginning, and it's just almost impossible to get them now because they're just way too expensive. I think I actually paid maybe like 60, 70 bucks for that, and that was when there was like people weren't buying houseplants in the same way that they do now. One more thing I will say about this before we kind of do any replanting and me talking while we're replanting is that it's important with the caudiciform that it stays above the surface of the soil substrate. So that's something that we're going to show when we're actually repotting this. And the importance of that is that you don't want it too far down into the soil substrate, because if it gets too much water, it will eventually just rot away. If it's too far above the soil substrate, then the roots start to die back, especially the tops of those roots. And then when the top roots actually die back, there's no way for it to get nutrients and water up through into the rest of the plant, into the aerial portions of the plant. So that's really important to consider when you're actually replanting it. And I will talk about the substrate. I'm going to use like a regular cactus mix. This is from Espoma. And then I also have their bonsai mix, which I really like for succulents. I've been using it a lot. And I have some extra perlite. Perlite is very useful and to increase the drainage within a soil substrate. You could also use vermiculite, and I have a video entirely on the difference between perlite and vermiculite. You will notice when you're actually using something like vermiculite is that it actually takes on the water and soaks it up a bit more, so it holds onto the water, whereas perlite, the type of structure that perlite has, the water basically washes off of it, so it doesn't really cling to perlite's surface in the same way that vermiculite holds on water. So those are two very important qualities that I would say that if you want to maintain a little more water while still getting drainage within your soil substrate, then you might want to go with a vermiculite versus a perlite, for instance. The other thing I will have to say about Dioscorea and a lot of caudiciforms is that they need a rest period. Please give them a rest period. They will typically lose their leaves in the hot months, so in the summer months, for instance. I think indoors, especially if they're indoors or if they're in a greenhouse, they may react a little differently than if they were out in the wild, and they may hold on to their leaves a little bit longer. That's what this guy has done, or they'll put out the leaves a little earlier than they should. But it's important to give them a rest period, and when they're in the rest period, you don't need to water them very much. It's very sparingly, because if you water them during their rest period and they're not growing, they may just rot. And my mistake with my first Dioscorea is that I just forgot about it. And that's an issue when it comes to caudiciforms, because if you don't know when they're snapping out of their slumber, and you forget about them and you kind of push them off into the corner. Same thing if you get an amaryllis bulb or something for winter time, for Christmas time, and you kind of forget about it. It's downstairs, it's in a paper bag, and you're like, oh yeah, those amaryllis bulbs, duh. Yeah, so then you kind of like lose track of them. But anyway, so like I said, this is a fine size of a planter. And I think what I'm going to go for, I have two planters here. So I have this one, if you remember, I was actually using it the last time I was doing a repotting. And I love this one, I love the color of it. It has a bit of a shallow dish though, unfortunately. So when you water it, it could easily spill over, which is a problem. So might have to do like a double dish. And then I have this one here, which I think is really beautiful too. I love that color. Kind of that rusty color with some splashes of cream. These are a little smaller than this terracotta planter, but in one case it's wide, and I don't know if the root structure is like as deep as this planter pot. So that's something that we're going to take a look today. And you know, I could just keep it in this terracotta planter, but honestly, ooh, that came flying out. Honestly, like I could start all over again, you know, this is gonna be for a new house. And the idea of actually doing something that's, you know, really matchy-matchy. Not matchy-matchy, not that everything's like terracotta, but terracotta is definitely like a tertiary color within this home. So I'm gonna add some more perlite, and I'm gonna spray it because if you recall last time when we were doing a repotting, which was just like last week, it's very dusty, and you don't want that. You don't want to breathe that in. right? So, but I like to add a lot of perlite. And if you could see this mixture here, it already has quite a bit of perlite in it, which is very good. And I will say that you could get different sizes of perlite. So if you're doing this at scale, oftentimes you could get perlite at wholesale, or in bulk, not in wholesale, but in bulk. And you could get different sizes of perlite. So when you go to like plant shows and plant conferences and all that kind of stuff, you could get like a thicker perlite ball, I guess. This one is a little bit more finer grain, and that's fine. I added some of that bonsai mixture. I think that's so beautiful, and I might actually add that to the top. And I will say that in the native environment, Dioscorea elephantipes, they grow in more stony environments. So they'll grow on rock faces, they'll grow on like a quartzite. They kind of grow in a lot of different places, but I think one of the underlying characteristics is that the fact that it's a bit rockier or stonier. So obviously there's like some pretty good drainage that's associated with that. So I'm gonna try to recreate that a little bit while still having some substrate in here so that when I do fertilize it, it just doesn't like wash right out. So that's what I'm doing here. And then I'll probably top it off with some of that bonsai mixture, which is something that I'm doing typically. And I am going to reuse some of this potting mixture. So here we go. It's a nice root system. Here we go, that's all out. I originally had this in a really tiny yellow pot that didn't even have a base. It just kind of, somebody had given it to me during one of the plant swaps, and they had like a cheesecloth underneath it. So I don't know, it was kind of a weird planter. It was basically, think about a cylinder, a ceramic cylinder without a base. So they kind of like fastened a hair rubber band around it with a cheesecloth. I thought that was kind of interesting, and obviously that's really good drainage, but it just wasn't sustainable to keep it in there. Okay, so this has really chunky perlite. I really like the size of this perlite. And the root structure looks really good. I wonder if I could just slide this over and show it up to the camera that's a bit more up close. Okay, Jesus Christ, a titmouse just hit the window. It's just, I have these things that are on the window to prevent birds from hitting them, but sometimes they get really excited and they come right up to the window. Okay, last time a gray squirrel came right up to the window, like expecting some peanuts. All right, so that's what this looks like. All right, this looks so good. Nice root system, nice healthy root system, so I'm very pleased with that. But the root system is not that crazy, so this might be a little too small. I would maybe go with this one because I could really spread the roots out. They could grow outwards a bit more. So I'm gonna go with that. I'm gonna mix up some of this nice big perlite with the newer substrate that I have. Ooh, that is a nice mix. Let me just show that to you. Harder when I have to film this myself because I have to make sure that I'm getting all the angles. This right here, I'm working with a large spoon, which is basically my choice of scoop here when I'm working with some of these small planters. I have some of my favorite kitchen utensils that I use in planting. So that's an old episode, so I'll link to that here. I thought that was a fun episode of some of those really fun kitchen utensils that I like to use that I end up using that is not even designated for gardening at the end of the day. So again, I want to make sure that I position this in a way where I'm not burying the caudex. These plants are so sculptural. And I know you might say, oh, I hate the ones that lose their leaves because they look so ugly after a while, or they might like get a little yellow and then they kind of like wither away. But a caudiciform is just, I guess it's like an acquired taste. Like you could display them very well because of that caudiciform. And I think that's why some plant collectors actually really enjoy them, is because they have that kind of wacky and weird base, and then put them in a really beautiful planter. Like I feel like the terracotta was a bit too too common. It needs something a bit more display worthy, if you will. Oh, so I have another funny update. I can't expect that all of you watched the last video, that are watching the last video or watching this video, because you might just be like, oh, I just clicked on this because I want to know more about Dioscorea elephantipes. But for those of you who did watch the last repotting video, I will give you a a personal update. So I got a call from one of my partners here, Sonder, and he goes, I don't think you're feeding the brown anole that came off of that plant. It came off a clethra. It came off an outdoor plant. Probably came from Florida, this little brown anole lizard. And I called him Mr. Anole. Probably know where I'm already going with this. And he goes, the lizard's shrunk. I don't think you're feeding him enough. And he took a picture, and I couldn't really tell from the picture like how big it was. I didn't understand what he was saying. Well, then he said there's 2 anoles, and I only put 1 anole in the terrarium. Wouldn't you know, Mr. Anole turned out to be a Mrs. Anole. And she came with some baggage. She came to me preggers, and now she has a swollen abdomen. And I know she's gonna just start pumping out like more anole babies. So, my goodness, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Crazy. All right, so I'm kind of packing this in here. Yeah. So now I have many anoles. This is how it starts. You start with 1 animal, and then you have like 20 after that. Same thing with plants. Start with 1 plant, and all of a sudden you have like 200. Okay, so this is this, and I'm going to just now take some of this really beautiful, let me just show you this. That is just shale and clay bits, expanded clay and shale. So what that means is they will heat it at high temperature. Same thing as perlite, same thing as vermiculite. I have a whole video on how that actually happens. How do they get this nice lightweight stone? And they just heat it at really high temperatures, and it basically puffs them like popcorn. So I've just added that to the top. Gosh, that looks so good. That color, I love that mixture. Get a little bit more of that. Ooh, so nice. Okay, so what I'm gonna do with this is, yes, I'm going to water it, but I'm also going to give it some fertilizer. So I just have this cactus fertilizer right here, which is my fail-safe. I think it's so easy to use. They used to have these caps where you could just pour it in, and it gives you 1 per quart, and I really liked that, but some people actually, I guess, didn't understand it, so they just use this like a kind of a detergent cap now. But I like the old one. So you'll actually find videos of me using that old cap, but this is one that you can measure out. This is a small container, so I'm not going to over fertilize it. And then I'm just going to water it in. And again, this is the time to actually water this plant, because if you don't, when it's growing, if you don't water it when it's growing, then it'll probably end up losing its leaves and then dry out. But you don't want to overwater it either. But it's very hard, if you remember what I said last time, and probably in some of my previous videos, it's very hard to overwater a plant with very good drainage. So if you're somebody who has a tendency to overwater, then just make sure that you put very good drainage. It's a very good opportunity to understand how much of what style of plant parent you are, I guess is what I could say. And you'll see that some of these tips have dried out. So if you want, and what I'll probably end up doing with this plant is maybe put in a little wire U, upside down U, in this, and then allow it to kind of tendril, because sometimes if it doesn't get anything to grab onto and tendril around, its tips will start to get brown, or you might accidentally set something on the top of the tip and then it's not growing anymore, which, I had it sitting here and it was like underneath the base of it. So that could happen as well. So yeah, this is your Dioscorea elephantipes. I'm trying to think of if I forgot anything that I really wanted to say with this plant, but I think we covered like the name, its habitat, the usual type of substrate and ecosystem it's growing in, where it's from, what a caudiciform is, the type of morphology that it exhibits, when it actually goes deciduous. I mean, we really covered a lot in this repotting video. So consider this a bit more of a more detailed care video than, comparatively to 365 days of plants. But there you have it, really beautiful plant in a upgraded beautiful planter, I would have to say. And I'll see you next time on Plant One On Me. All right, guys, take care. Bye. Interested in developing a deeper relationship with the people and plants around you? Then check out my book, How to Make a Plant Love You. Cultivate green space in your home and heart. More information up on my blog at homesteadbrooklyn.com. And if you're looking for more tactical plant care, then you could turn to the Houseplant Masterclass, which is the first online audiovisual course on houseplant cultivation, care, maintenance, and more at houseplantmasterclass.com.